So this is a very special episode, hearkening back to our after-school special days of the Literary Atlanta podcast, and it's a crossover event with the Bitter Southerner. I am joined here by co-founders Chuck Reece, who's also editor-in-chief of the Bitter Southerner, and Kyle Tibbs Jones, who is the media director, and the mother of the Bitter Southerner's 2018 and previous years summer reading roundup. Thank you both for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. All right. So we're all ready to get our pencils and paper out, and if you use those archaic tools, and add to our to-be-read list. But before that, Kyle, can you tell me a little bit about the Bitter Southerner's summer reading roundup list? How did this get started, and kind of what's the goal of sharing this list of books each year?
Well, Chuck and I, we have so many books that are sent to us, and we are both big readers, and we love Southern literature, obviously. And the first year we did it, honestly, it was cheap content. I'm not kidding.
Right.
No, but we wanted to do it. But I mean, it was just something that we could do, and it didn't require us paying someone to do it. We did it ourselves, and we loved it, and it was beloved by our readers, and it's been a joy. The first few years, we did a lot of interviewing of bookstores. This year, we didn't really do that. We still have a fantastic independent Southern bookshop list attached to the story.
Right.
But over the years, I've gotten to know all those cool independent booksellers by doing this list. So it's just been a joy.
Yes, and it's kind of a tricky quagmire almost, Chuck, because when you stop to define what Southern literature is or a Southern reading is, then it's kind of the beginning of a debate, not the end of one.
That is true. That is true.
So how do you define, or how do you come up with this list and make it a Bitter Southerner branded list?
We do take care on this list to make sure that the authors, if they don't live currently in the American South, however you define that.
They're writing about it.
They're writing about it, yeah. And they're from here, So that's really how we do it. But, what is Southern literature is a giant question that no one can answer. So we solve that problem by not trying to answer it. And we just share with people the books that we think might be important to our audience, an audience that looks at the South from a less than traditional perspective, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I think it's fair to say that this is not your mama's beach bag full of books that she would haul with her to the sandy isles of Panama City,
Allison, we do have some books for mamas.
Yeah.
We do have some books for a little bit of everything this year. This is the first year we have, we had one a while back, but we have like 3 cookbooks this year. We have a couple of YA novels, one elementary school appropriate, beautiful little book. So we're varied.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, where do we want to start? What book leapt out to you this year, and you knew right away that this had to be on the reading
That's a good
roundup
question.
list?
Do we have a superstar book, Chuck?
Well, I feel like...
What do you think it is?
It's all subjective. I know the three of us could all arm wrestle over.
We love everything on this list, right? Can we just say that? But what do we have like a standout?
Well, I mean, there has been a lot of great fiction coming out, and it's really tough to say. I really love The Fighter by Michael Ferris Smith, just because I just love the quality and style of his writing so much. He has this ability, how Faulkner could actually write these sort of 200-word stream of consciousness sentences and really take you someplace special by doing that.
Right.
But that's a really difficult trick for writers to pull off. And Michael has the ability to do that. I mean, he just writes in a way like where you feel like you're not just inside the character, but you're like deep inside the character's head. And just from, someone who pays attention every day to
Beautiful words.
and how people write. To see stuff like that is incredible.
He does have some beautiful sentences in there. And when I talked to Michael earlier on the podcast, he was saying that ultimately the book, The Fighter, is about love.
Oh yeah, it's a total love story, and it's about an essential kind of love, a parental kind of love, because Jack Boucher, the main character in the book, is trying to do right by really the only person in his entire life who's ever done right by him, which is the woman who took him in as a foster child and raised him, and who is, at the time of the book's writing, dying. And he wants to make sure that she is able to die at home. So it's a book about that really sort of basic mother-son.
Fierce love.
Yeah. And, that's an interesting word to use, actually, because, he's lived his whole life being fierce for a living, fighting for a living. And it's interesting to think that, he's doing it because he's trying to repay a love that was just as fiercely given to him.
I think we have a mother theme.
Among all of the books from the Bitter Southerner Roundup?
Well, I'm just thinking about...
What came to mind when you said that?
The Comfort Food Diaries.
Okay. Yeah, I know that this was a book that you were really excited to talk about.
I really love this book. It was published in September of last year and just has had glowing reviews. And I didn't get my hands on it until a few weeks ago. Emily Nunn, I think she's about my age, and she went through a terrible breakup. And this is her memoir of recovery and recovery from the breakup, from heartbreak, from addiction. And the mother thing, the thing I was thinking about, as there's some Southern Gothic relationships in this book. I mean, it starts when her brother commits suicide. And this is Emily's attempt to heal as she reconnects with family members and friends. I don't know if you've ever been through a breakup or a divorce or something, you realize you assign, some friends are not the friends you thought they were, and some friends, complete strangers can become the best of friends. And this book takes you through that. It's just beautiful.
And that is definitely the sign of a good memoir, is that when you feel that universality, because who hasn't been through a breakup and seeing how those big tumultuous times in your life bring out the best and worst in people.
I love this. I'm the social person at the Bitter Southerner. I'm the voice across all the social platforms. And Emily, at her lowest, darkest moment, put a note on Facebook. And it was like, I'm broke. I've been dumped. I don't have a home. She was drunk. And she put this note out there. And the next morning she woke up just cringing that she had put it out there. And people poured the love that poured out to her was incredible. She could not believe it. And they all decided on Facebook that she was going to do the comfort food tour. So she was going to go and cook for people. She had been a food writer in New York, a theater writer, actually, and also had written a lot about food. And so she did this comfort food tour to see all these friends, some people, that she hadn't seen in many, many years. It's just beautiful. I love it. I know I've said beautiful a lot, but it's really, I love this book.
Beautiful.
It's lovely.
It's lovely.
It's lovely, beautiful,
it's more
and
than
gorgeous.
That. It's deep. It's relatable.
What else jumps out at you from the list? Because this is a really diverse list. You have fiction, you have history list, you have some cookbooks, what we've labeled here as cookbooks and food books, but they're really almost food history books. I think you were talking about that earlier. Particularly
one of them, The Cooking Gene. The book did come out last year. It came out too late for us to include it on the list, but there are two books that have come out in the past 12 months. The Pot Liquor Papers by John T. Edge, who is the executive director of the Southern Foodways Alliance at the University of Mississippi, and by Michael Twitty, who is an independent writer and culinary historian. And both of those books, I believe, stand not only as great books about food, but they're two of the best histories of the American South I've read, because one is looking at the people who were feeding the people who changed the South. The women who cooked for the Freedom Riders and the Civil Rights Marchers and stuff like that. That's the kind of stuff that John T. covers. Michael goes deeper into what the roots of the Southern food really are, and he lets you know that he's not going to pull any punches right from the beginning of the book, because when he's talking about the South, he says it's a place where we do not ask which came first, the African cook or the European mistress. And but he asks those tough questions in this book, and it's a really important book to read. And I've known Michael for a few years now. I knew he was working on this book, and I knew it was going to be heavy. I knew the subject matter he was going after would be heavy.
Right.
But I was really joyously surprised at how good a storyteller he is in his ability to drag you through, or to just speed you through is what I should say, all these different parts of the very complex story. And, he weaves his own quest to find out this information into it in a way that's just, to use the word of the day, beautiful.
Have you ever seen him speak, Allison? I mean,
I have not seen him
house.
speak, unfortunately, but I know that last year at the Decatur Book Festival, when he did an appearance there, he sold out of his books. And since then, just in recent weeks, he has been awarded 2 James Beard Awards for the cooking gene.
Deservedly so.
He won the Best Writing Award in the book category, and then he won Best Book.
Yeah.
So we have that book about food, and then we also have on this year's list Turnip Greens and Tortillas by Eddie Hernandez and Susan Puckett.
Yeah,
for
one of my favorites.
taqueria fans, and it's a great book. And we both love Susan Puckett and her writing. She's someone that we admire greatly. And then the other is Soul by Chef Todd Richards.
And Todd Richards is another friend of the Bitter Southerner who has this new book that's just come out.
He cooked a goat for us one time.
He cooked a goat for you?
Yeah, on a goat farm.
Yeah, at the goat farm.
Goat on the goat farm.
Is he allowed back now, or?
Yeah, no. We had
fantastic.
an event there. It was just sort of it was something we did one summer. We did a series of these little
Pop-up parties,
events, and it was not long after a story that I had written about White Oak Pastures Farms, the big organic farm down in South Georgia. And that had come out recently. And we had Will Harris, who owns that farm, come up and talk to people about the importance of good soil. And he volunteered to bring up an animal that could be barbecued, and he brought a goat.
And that we did.
And Chef Todd Richards came over there, and I remember he rubbed it with ground coffee. And God almighty, it was good. But no,
Chuck Reece, ladies and gentlemen.
That's good God almighty. Yeah.
Well, let me tell you about Soul.
Yeah.
I want to talk about this book. It is Chef's homage to his. Well, I'm going to read this. This book is my homage to the cuisine of my family and ancestors. These are the ingredients of my people. This is my sermon about my soul food. The chapters are short and organized by ingredient. That way, if you get a bumper crop of greens, you can flip to the collards chapter, or if it's peach season, you can, go to the farmer's market, load up on some vegetables. Now I'm paraphrasing, but
you want to see what's fresh and available at your farmer's market.
But the cool thing about this is Chef Todd talks about soul food and its evolution and how multicultural soul food actually is. We kind of limit it in a lot of ways, a lot of times, and he pushes the genre. So there's a lot of mashups of cultures. Like he has, if you've ever eaten at Richard's Southern Fried in Krog Street Market in Atlanta, he has collared pho. And here he's got collard ramen, collard green ramen.
So Asian cuisine
yes,
and
it's all
Southern
mixed,
cuisine,
yeah.
right?
Anyway, and the photography's gorgeous, and he calls himself a preacher, and I am part of the congregation. I
All right.
love this book.
Excellent. And this year on your reading roundup, you were responding to your readers who were asking for some titles from young adult and middle grades and for children's books. And this is also a complicated thing because those are universes unto themselves. I mean,
Very popular genre right now, though, right?
Right,
Really growing.
I really think that some of the most creative and interesting writing that's happening right now is happening in young adult fiction.
Talk to us about Amal's book.
Oh, Amal Unbound.
Amal Unbound, yeah.
Yeah.
Who's the writer?
The writer is Ayesha Saeed.
Right.
She is Pakistani American. Her family is from Pakistan. She grew up in Florida, graduated from University of Florida as an attorney, and moved to Atlanta to be a social justice attorney. And since then, she has written 2 books. Her first book, Written in the Stars, was a young adult novel. And then Amal Unbound, which just debuted in the past week on the New York Times bestseller list.
That's so great.
Is a middle grades novel, which is partly inspired by one of the more famous Pakistani women, Malala Yousafzai.
Right.
And her story is, of course, that we've all learned is she was 15 years old. She was very outspoken about education for girls, and she was shot at point blank range by a member of the Taliban and survived and went on to become the youngest Nobel Peace Prize winner and has started the Malala Fund. So we have Malala's story, which is very well known now in our culture, but Ayesha wanted to write about all of the children and young people who are resisting through these really small but mighty acts who didn't make headlines. Mm-hmm. So Amal is the eldest of 4 daughters, and she unwittingly insults the wealthy ruling family in her Pakistani village, and for that reason, she becomes an indentured servant to that family. And she is separated from her family and everything that she loves. She wanted to be a school teacher, and now it looks like she's no longer going to be going to school. So what she does is she sneaks into the library of this family and she reads poems by Rumi and other poets, and she teaches the other people that she is a servant with. And so it's these small, bold acts of resistance that Amal Unbound really
that sounds so good. I
about,
cannot wait to read that. Allison, one thing I didn't say at the beginning when you asked me about the Southern Reading Roundup, this year for the first time we have some YA books and 1 children's book, and we have some cookbooks. But another first this year is that you helped us with this Southern Reading Roundup. I'm sorry I forgot to say that.
Oh.
For the first time, we have Miss Allison Law, our literary icon in Atlanta. You are.
I wouldn't say any of that business. But
thank you for being part of this.
No, I mean, it was absolutely my pleasure because I do read this, and I am a member of the Bitter Southerner family, so
we appreciate you.
it's nice that.
It was very nice to have somebody else in the sandbox with us this year because, I mean, you just can't read all the books.
No.
And I would expect now that you have been doing this podcast for a while that your mailbox, like mine, probably has at least 1 book arrive in it every day. Am I right?
Yeah, every day.
And you just look at the stack sometimes and you go,
it's undoable.
All these people put lots of hard work and heart into this, but you literally just can't get to them all.
Yeah, and when Kyle and I first started talking about this too, it was just like, I kept adding to the list because I kept thinking of these books that I wanted everybody to, I want everybody to know about this book. It's amazing. But,
so thank you for adding those. And what we can say to everyone who's listening is that we didn't have time to review all of them, but we do have a really healthy list there. So make sure you look at all the names and the
And we've
titles.
also got, a short list of about 5 upcoming novels in particular that I
Yeah.
know I'm pretty excited about them.
David
so.
Joy, David Joy, David Joy.
Well, I'm a fan. I can't help it. He and I
We're
are
all fans, but you guys are.
well, we're cut
y'all
from
have
the same
bonded.
cloth.
I know.
Well, some
y'all
of the people, that's a good thing to talk about. Some of the people who show up on this list with their full-length books have written a long-form piece for the Bitter Southerner.
Well, a lot of that goes back to the fact that I've learned how to play a trick. Every time, every time I get asked to interview a writer, and typically the person who asks me to do that is Frank Reece, who owns Acapella Books, and he has.
Or Chuck, the Atlanta History Center.
Yeah, well, I
Yeah.
have the Atlanta History Center, but most often it's Frank, and he'll say, "We got this book coming out by so and so. He's coming in on book tour. Would you interview him? At an event somewhere?" And I say yes. One of the reasons I say yes is because it makes me read the books, and not just have that guilt feeling that you have that you didn't get to anything in that whole giant stack. But when I finish that interview,
You make the ask.
I make the ask. I mean, what
What's
I
in
say
it for
is-
me, right?
Well, with a novelist, I say, if you've got some kind of essay or piece of nonfiction lying around that you don't know what to do with, I'd sure love to read it. And
it's not just long form. Chuck, Michael Ferris, who is one of the books we're most excited about on this list, Michael Ferris Smith, I always forget the Smith. He wrote a column for us.
very short.
But that was the most shared, maybe the most shared piece in social media that we've published this year.
One of the most, for
One of
sure.
the
It was
most,
called
yeah.
The United States of Mississippi, about the difficulty of being a citizen of the great state of Mississippi.
Well, and he was also talking about in this political climate that the entire country's in, that we're all from Mississippi. That was the point of the whole
Yeah.
piece. It was beautiful.
And,
Geez,
it's interesting when you get these people who normally think in terms of character and plot and things like that. When you release them from that, something happens
Yeah.
sometimes, and that's been good. And, David wrote a piece for us after I interviewed him about The Weight of This World, his second novel. And,
Very personal piece.
yeah. And he wrote this piece called Digging in the Trash for us, which is essentially looking at the way that people refer to folks, in the mountains, low-income people, as trash. And it was a fierce defense of those people. And that was by far the most widely read story on our online magazine last year.
Mm-hmm.
And
When I
actually, it's included in the
reprint.
paperback edition of The Weight of This World that has just come out. Although I did see a typo in it, and David's upset, so they're fixing that.
maybe we won't bring that up. But I know that when I spoke to Taylor Brown earlier on the Literary Atlanta podcast, we talked about his piece for the Bitter Southerner called Rednecks.
That was really unusual.
Yeah, and it was part of this book.
He wrote a piece of fiction, and but it was, and Taylor himself doesn't like the term historical fiction. I haven't quite figured out why, because it seems to describe what he does very well. But we have run fiction in the past, and we haven't always had good luck with it. But he wrote this piece that was so grounded in the history of the West Virginia coal mine wars.
And set on the heels of the Charlottesville
Yeah, and it was
incident.
just a masterful weaving of fact around. The only thing that was fictional about it was the narrative and the plot of the story.
Mm-hmm.
That was it. And I felt like I read it and I was like, okay, we got to run this. We don't do this kind of thing normally, but we got to run this. And I want this publication. I've always wanted this publication to be a place where great writers in the South feel like they can find an audience for whatever it is they feel like they need to say. And it's a hard thing to do, but, just from a purely, workaday point of view, if there's somebody out there who's capable of writing a book, they're darn sure capable of writing a story for us. So,
Yes.
I like to encourage them to do that.
Yes. Well, and it reminds me too, I was just listening to the audiobook for the 10th anniversary author cut edition of Neil Gaiman's American Gods. And interspersed in the chapters, the main narrative are these coming to America stories of these people who brought their gods to America. And one of them talks about how we can see the numbers of the people who perished in the Holocaust, or we can see all of these statistics about people who have immigrated to our country. But until we have one folk tale or one story, that one individual's fictionalized story, we don't truly have empathy or understand where they're coming from. And so I think that's a good plug for the fiction titles, the mini fiction titles that you have on this list here, so that you do have both nonfiction and then you have these inner stories. Speaking of historical fiction, you have a title on here, Visible Empire by Hannah Petard.
We do. We included that. It actually comes out next week. But that book is based on the Orly plane crash. Can't say that today. Plane crash. And it's 1962. That plane has just gone down with 100 of Atlanta's wealthiest art patrons and their brothers and sisters and parents and sons and daughters. And even, there's one character in the book that's a mistress that was on the plane that perishes in that plane crash. Anyway, it's set around in a historical event, but it's how do I put it? It's a beach read. It's a little gossipy. You read this and you are reading something that is set around an actual event that really hurt Atlanta and hurt so many people. But it's, one character's mistress died on the plane and his wife is pregnant and he leaves her. He's so distraught over his mistress, he leaves her. And the entire book is how they eventually find each other again, the pregnant wife and the husband. Anyway, it's good.
Is, though. But
you read it.
I mean, that's the thing, too, right? I did read the book, and the thing that I like about historical fiction is that it makes me want to Google everything, right?
too.
And find out what really happened. And like you said, trying to understand who these fictional characters may have been based on, right?
If you're from Georgia or from Atlanta, you definitely read this thinking, who is that based on? Who's that character based on?
This sounds like, and I haven't read that book yet, but y'all talking about it makes me want to read it pretty badly just for that ability. When you get something like that that's about your hometown. I mean, it reminds me of 20 years ago this year, actually, when A Man in Full came out, Tom Wolfe's book that was set in Atlanta and elsewhere in Georgia, and everybody was trying to figure out, okay.
Tom who just passed this week.
Last week,
You know what it reminds me of is Ann Rivers Siddon's Peachtree Road. Do y'all remember reading that?
I haven't read that one.
I've never read that.
You never, and everybody was like, who is this? Like, who are these characters? Because they were all based on.
But I also don't want your readers and my listeners to think that it's all Atlanta centric here, because
God,
no. No, our list is not. That's the last thing. It's
you should see these two pieces of paper that I have in front of me, because what we did was we were kind of tracking, like, okay, here's where the author is from. We have great representation from, Chris Offutt and Lisa Cross Smith and Hannah Petard, who are all, Kentucky people, and then we also have. Michael Ferris Smith from Mississippi, Joe Crespino, who's written the first biography of Atticus Finch, who's originally from Mississippi. So it's a
Emily
great
Nunn from Virginia, living in North Carolina. I think the only thing we're maybe missing is Arkansas.
Yeah.
Is that what we said?
Yeah, Arkansas was the only. But
Arkansas will get you next year.
Yeah.
We're coming to find you, Arkansas.
That's right. So you can submit your story now to the Bitter Southerner, and we'll get it rolling. Right.
Send your books.
And we have a lot of books on here that have been recognized. The Gulf, The Making of an American Sea, which just won a Pulitzer Prize and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. It's a beautiful, beautiful book about the Gulf Coast and the environment there. And
we also have that Pat Conroy book that we
Yes.
ran.
My Exaggerated Life,
that we ran an excerpt from.
Yeah, I mean,
Catherine Clark.
Yeah, for people who don't know about
Pat
that.
Conroy on sex.
Yeah, that was what we call the excerpt we ran. We titled it "Pat Conroy on Sex (parentheses) and Love (close parentheses).
I was
because
very
about
nervous
both.
about this story.
Oh, why?
Well, it was.
Too scintillating for the bitter
Well,
Southerner?
the first two paragraphs were more than we'd ever. I don't know, Chuck. Describe it.
Well, it was accurate, unflinching description of genitalia. You know, I mean, if you really want to know what it was, and we'd never gone close to that in the first paragraph of a story, certainly, but, you know, it's Pat Conroy.
He described it, and also it was a coming of age for a young Catholic boy. And anyway.
Well, I think, you know.
It was good.
Yeah, and this book from Catherine it's interesting because, you know, Conroy's written about his life a lot. Arguably, his, you know, fiction was very autobiographical in many ways, particularly if you go back to the earliest stuff. But, you know, I loved the fact that in the last 2 years of his life, he spent all this time talking to a writer, Catherine Clark, whose work he admired. We actually had one of Catherine's novels on our list last year, and, you know, basically the idea of, you know, knowing that your life is probably short, telling your life story so unflinchingly to another person, you know, with the agreement that essentially what he was doing was talking his autobiography. And he, you know, allowed her the ability to take all these conversations and to edit them together into a way that told his life story. And I think she did a fabulous job of doing that. Like, you know, I have done long interviews with people, long and repeated interviews with people, and looked at all those transcripts. And if I were to think, you know, how could I take 6 hours of conversation with someone and just use their own words out of it to get the story told? That's no easy feat.
And very intimidating when you're talking about someone of Pat Conroy's stature.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, I've spoken to Catherine about this. She knew and really felt that, you know, she had his blessing and his confidence, and I think that gave her the confidence to, you know, take on that monumental task of trying to put this book together. And I also love the title of it too, My Exaggerated Life.
I love that too.
Well, we have this list. We're going to have to wrap things up. Kyle, as the mother of the Bitter Southerner Summer Reading Roundup, what do you want people to do with this list of books? What's your hope?
My hope is that people read. Go get these books. Go get them from independent booksellers.
Yeah.
Support your books, your small bookshops, and your independent bookstores. And what I really want to say is, we have some new things on this list. Again, we'll say we've got cookbooks this year that read like novels. You know, put that cookbook in your bag, take it to the beach, especially Soul and the Cooking Gene. And we have some children's books. There's a little bit of something for everyone. But also, we have not gotten to every single fabulous book out there.
Right.
Please tell us on Twitter, tell us on Facebook, send us a note on Instagram, tell us what you're reading, and we will repost it. We want to share as much good literature as possible.
We love to be turned on to new stuff.
We do. So
Yeah, this is a two-way street conversation here. We want to know.
exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Kyle Tibbs Jones and Chuck Reece at the Bitter Southerner, for being on Literary Atlanta podcast and for inviting me to the party. All of the books are going to be on the Bitter Southerner website and on the Literary Atlanta website.
And we also have a handy-dandy link in there to the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance site with a complete list of all the indie bookstores in the South where you can buy these things.
And remember, they'll ship too, just like those big
That is right.
often with a signed, they often have signed stock too. So if you want a signed book, makes an excellent Father's Day present.
Allison, also thank you so much for being part of this year.
My pleasure.
We are grateful.